Today I'm showing you step by step how to create the most amazing apple and cinnamon cake. I'll walk you through my entire cake design and recipe development process for creating the perfect autumn cake and share the step by step process of how I created this mesmerizing apple rose. My name is Louise and I'm a self-taught cake artist and recipe developer. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create the most outstanding apple cinnamon cake. This cake contains all my favorite autumn flavors and has a prominent apple flavor, perfectly balanced with vanilla and pecan. For this cake, I wanted to combine some different textures, which is why the cake contains crumble, pastry cream, fruit compote and also Praliné, which I think really makes the cakes outstanding. I'm going to show you the process behind developing this cake recipe, my thoughts behind creating the perfect autumn apple cake, and how I made this elegant apple rose decoration. To make this cake, I'm also going to show you how to master the following techniques: a moist apple and cinnamon cake with Biscoff cream, a crunchy cinnamon and gingerbread crumble, a smooth vanilla pastry cream, a moist fresh apple compote with lemon, a crunchy pecan cinnamon Praliné, an airy white chocolate, vanilla and apple mousse, a shiny transparent glaze, and last but not least, the most beautiful apple rose. And if you want to bake the cake at home, you can find the full recipe here on my website, which you can access with a subscription. I'm going to show you how to make the following layers: apple and cinnamon cake with Biscoff cream, cinnamon and gingerbread crumble, vanilla pastry cream, fresh apple compote with lemon, pecan and cinnamon Praliné, white chocolate, vanilla and apple mousse, transparent glaze, apple rose with fruit glaze, and chocolate decoration. If you want to learn more about how to make elegant, layered and delicious entremet cakes, you can now check out my online course, Master Entremet Cakes at Home, where I show you how to create professional quality cakes from start to finish, right from your own kitchen. Inside the course, I teach you my 5-step formula that I use for all my cakes: cake base, crunch, creamy element, mousse and decoration. You'll also learn how to make 5 of my signature entremet cakes, different glazing techniques, discover recipe development and cake design, and also receive PDF troubleshooting guides and Excel recipe course material, giving you everything you need to start creating your own cakes at home. Alright, let's get started! To make this apple cinnamon entremet, I knew I wanted to create the perfect apple cake. This is gonna be the bottom of our cake, bring in that warm apple flavor, spice with lots of cinnamon, and create a stable base for the cake. It contains lots of fresh apples and apple puree to give it a prominent fruit flavor, as well as swirls of Biscoff cream to add creaminess and even more cinnamon flavor. To make this apple cake, I start out by mixing all the dry ingredients: flour, baking powder, baking soda, salt, cinnamon and nutmeg. Before we can mix the wet ingredients, I'm making apple puree by boiling apples until tender, hand blending and straining the mixture to get a smooth puree. We can then mix oil, sugar, brown sugar, apple puree, eggs, vanilla paste and apple juice with a hand mixer before mixing in the dry ingredients. The apple puree gives the cake a moist texture and stabilizes the consistency after defrosting the cake, and also brings the most amazing apple flavor. Lastly, I chop fresh apples into smaller cubes and stir it in the batter. I pour the batter in a pastry ring, then add Biscoff cream that I've slightly thinned in the microwave and put it on top of the batter. Using the end of a spoon, I swirl the Biscoff through the dough. Before we can bake the cake, let's now prepare the cinnamon and gingerbread crumble that will go on top. I always love a good crumble, and especially on top of an apple cake. So I decided to add a layer of crumble on top of the cake to also add a crunchy element. The crumble is flavored with cinnamon and gingerbread cookies, which gives the crunch more flavor depth and also a bit more crunch. I here start out by blending pastry or gingerbread biscuits into crumbs and mixing it with flour, brown sugar and cinnamon. Then I melt butter and stir it in a bowl, where I mix with a fork to create crumble pieces. We can now add the crumble to the cake, where I bake it at 175 degrees fan-assisted oven for 30 to 35 minutes. Once the cake has cooled off, I put it in a clean pastry ring, level the surface, and put it in the fridge while preparing the next layer. To balance the apple and cinnamon flavor, I wanted to create a smooth layer with vanilla. And what's better here than a vanilla pastry cream? The pastry cream brings a perfectly balanced vanilla flavor to the cake, as well as a super smooth texture, which pairs perfectly with the other textures in this cake. To make a nice pastry cream, we have to use nice vanilla beans. So I'm first cutting vanilla beans and scraping out the seeds. I combine whole milk and cornstarch and mix this with egg yolks and sugar. The next step is to heat whole milk, vanilla pods and vanilla seeds almost to a boil before pouring the hot milk over the egg mixture. Then the mixture goes back in the pot, where I heat it while whisking until it thickens and gets an almost jelly consistency. We then strain the cream and stir in butter and soaked gelatin, which will help set the cream inside the entremet cake. Then the cream needs to set and cool to lukewarm, where I add room temperature heavy cream. The heavy cream and gelatin is what prevents the cream from seizing and giving it a creamy texture even after defrosting. After the pastry cream has set, I whip it again to a creamy consistency, put it in a piping bag before spreading the cream on top of the apple cinnamon cake. We can then put the cake in the freezer, where the surface needs to set before we can add the next layer, the apple compote. Besides the apple cake, I wanted to add another apple-focused layer, as this, after all, is an apple cake. So I decided to make a fresh apple compote seasoned with lemon to add a fresh twist to the cake and balance the vanilla flavor and cinnamon. I make the compote by first cutting fresh apples into cubes. I then mix sugar and pectin and put it aside. We then heat apple puree, sugar, vanilla and lemon juice to the boiling point before adding sugar and pectin. The mixture needs to cook until the puree is very thick, sticking to the whisker before taking it off the heat. I let the mixture cool off just slightly so it doesn't add too much heat to the apples, and then mix in fresh apples. I spread the compote on top of the set pastry cream, level the layer, and put the cake back in the freezer, where it needs to set before the last cake element can be added. To make a final autumn spin on this cake, I decided to include a layer with nuts. I love the pairing of apple and pecan, so I decided to make a pecan and cinnamon praliné. If you ask me, a praliné is the best way to get the most prominent nut flavor, and then it also adds a smooth and crunchy texture to the cake. I make the praliné by first melting sugar to a golden caramel and stirring in pecan nuts to cover them with the caramelized sugar. After the nuts have cooled off, I blend them to a smooth pecan nut paste praliné, while you see how the nuts first turn into a fine powder, then a dense paste, and finally a smooth paste. I add cinnamon and blend briefly to combine. I put the Praliné in a piping bag and spread it onto the cake. Lastly, I level the surface, and then the cake needs to freeze overnight. In addition to the vanilla pastry cream, I wanted to make a mousse with vanilla notes to balance the fruity and spicy flavors in the cake. I therefore decided to make a mousse that mixes white chocolate, vanilla and apple notes to make a rounded yet also fresh mousse. This mousse is also super light and airy, which I think complements the textures in the cake. I make the mousse by first melting white chocolate and pouring it in a bowl. I cut vanilla beans and scrape out the seeds. I then heat vanilla seeds, apple juice and lemon juice almost to a boil, whisking in soaked gelatin before pouring the mixture over the white chocolate. After it's cooled off, I whip heavy cream to a lightly whipped cream and fold it into the chocolate mixture. We then put the mousse in a silicone mold lined with acetate sheet and put in the frozen cake with the Praliné facing downwards. Then the cake needs to freeze fully overnight. As a decorative element, I initially planned to make a narrow mousse circle that will go on top of the cake, which is what you can see me prepare here. However, this ended up not working great in practice, which you'll see later on, but just for context, that's why you'll initially see this mousse circle on top of the cake. To decorate the cake, I wanted to add that extra shine without covering the mousse, as I wanted the beautiful vanilla seeds in the mousse to be visible. That's why I decided to make a transparent glaze instead of a full cover mirror glaze. Here, I heat sugar, water and glucose syrup in a saucepan to 105 degrees. I then take the pan off the heat, whip in soaked gelatin and add strained lemon juice before straining the glaze in a tall jug. And then it needs to cool to 35 degrees. Once the glaze is ready, I pour the glaze over the frozen cake and place the cake on a cake plate. I also glazed the mousse circle as I was planning to put this on top of the cake. But as you can see, it was quite tricky to place it on top of the cake as the circle is quite thin and it quickly defrosted, which made it difficult to put it on top of the cake. At this point, I still wanted to see how the circle would look encased in a chocolate ribbon, so I left it on for the time being. To match the colors of the flavors inside the cake and the red apple rose that will go on top of the cake, I decided to make pink chocolate ribbons to balance the color scheme. I therefore made 3 chocolate ribbons, while I placed the 2 white ribbons around the cake and the smallest ribbon around the mousse circle. Before making the apple rose, I'm making a clear fruit glaze so it can cool off while making the apple rose. I then boil sugar and the cornstarch mixture until the glaze starts to thicken. I here add a bit of glucose syrup and let the glaze boil up before taking it off the heat. I pour it in a small bowl and let it cool off a bit while preparing the apple rose. For the final decoration, I knew I wanted to use fresh apples as the main decorative element, which is why I decided to make a large apple rose. I love how elegant this looks, and it's really not nearly as difficult as it might seem at a first glance. To make an apple rose, you need to use a mandolin slicer to cut very thin apple slices. I'm here using very red apples for a stronger visual effect. To prevent the apples from browning, I briefly soak them in water mixed with lemon juice and then dry the apple slices, as wet slices will make the cake top soggy. I now start out by pairing slices in equal height and shape where I make sure that the top of the apples are at the same height. I then place several slices on top of each other and place a strip of apple slices inside the mousse ring. Then I just repeat this process all the way until the middle of the rose. For the middle, I make a small rose by again placing apple slices on top of each other, but instead of placing them directly onto the cake, I now roll it before placing it in the middle of the cake. And that's how you make a stunning apple rose. Like every creative mind, I also sometimes get ideas that don't work out as well in practice as I'd hoped for. That's why I took a second look at the mousse ring, since it didn't look as sharp as I wanted. I also figured that this might be too tricky for others to replicate in its final recipe if I also had trouble with it just doing it now. I therefore decided last minute to fully remove it from the cake and instead add a taller chocolate ribbon in the same color as the other ribbons. And honestly, I think this looks so much better. It looks more clean and it's a lot easier to make. We can now add the final touches, where I brush the rose with fruit glaze to add that extra shine. And lastly, I decorate with small white flowers. And here we have the final apple cinnamon cake that I am so happy with. I truly love how elegant the apple rose looks, and I'm so happy that I last minute decided to change the cake design, as this resulted in an elegant and balanced cake. To me, this really is the ultimate autumn cake because it has so much apple and cinnamon flavor, which for me that's just like my favorite autumn flavors, but also paired here with pecan and vanilla to add a bit of flavor contrast and also to round off the flavors. So to me, this really makes it the perfect apple cake. I hope you get the chance to make this amazing apple cake at home, and if you like my videos, make sure to subscribe, and you can also check out my Entremets cake playlist here. See you in the next video!